Well, hello. Welcome. I want to study again in the Old Testament in looking at the Mosaic age. We're studying really the life of David, doing an overview of the book of 2 Samuel. And in looking at this lesson, I want to continue with David's life, looking at David's trouble that arose in his life, the consequences that came about because of his sin with Bathsheba. God had forgiven David, as we studied last time. Spiritually speaking, he was forgiven of his sins. He was back in a right relationship with God. He truly repented. He drew near to God. He was grateful for God's mercy that had been shown to him. He wrote many psalms about this longing for God and trying to put things right. But God had announced to him that there was going to be consequences of that sin with Bathsheba, that God was going to raise up a sword in his house, and there was going to be a lot of trouble that was going to be in his house for the rest of his life. He was going to have problems because of this capital sin that he had committed in committing adultery and then having Uriah put to death by the hands of the Ammonites. And as a result of that, when you do things of that nature, there are oftentimes many consequences that you have to face, life-changing things that happen in your life. And that's what we see in David's life. But to his credit, he strove to remain faithful to God. He tried to draw near to God. He tried to put God first in his life. And he is an example for all of us that fall short and commit sin, that we need to keep on drawing near to God. We need to keep our faith. We need to turn our back on sin and try to do the very best we can while we're in this life. And that's what David does. But in this lesson, we'll see about the troubles that arose against him. Amnon, his oldest son, and one that would have been presumed according to human standards to become the next king after David, is full of lust, and he lusts after his own sister and ends up raping her. Her brother Absalom, another man that had ambitions to rule, is going to seek revenge. And as a result of how all of those events turned out, Absalom eventually rebels against David and leads a revolution against his father. And these things happen in 2 Samuel chapter 13 through chapter 16. There are many lessons in the life of David that we can learn from these examples in history. One of the ways that God teaches us, of course, is by command, but he also teaches us through example. Good examples and bad examples about how we should serve God and what the consequences of sin and disobedience are. And we're going to learn a lot from examples in this lesson. Many lessons that I hope to bring across, but others that you need to search as you study these things and meditate on other passages and laws that you know and try to make application of. Another thing you might bear in mind as you study the life of David, that he is the one through whom Jesus Christ is going to come. Jesus is known as the Son of David. He is the Christ, the King that was to sit on David's throne forever, as we studied last time. And there are a lot of events in David's life that through God's providence turn out to be foreshadowing things that would happen in the life of Christ. Jesus Christ was a faithful king, never committed a sin, and yet the people of God rebel against Jesus. They rebel against his rule. Some of his closest disciples, Judas, is going to betray him, and many are going through fear to fall away on the night Jesus was arrested. And so there are a lot of parallels in the sufferings and trials that David had during his reign that kind of foreshadow the things that are going to happen with our Lord Jesus Christ in his life. It's just an amazing thing how these Old Testament stories turn out to be types foreshadowing the things that would happen with the Christ. Well, let's look at how things unfolded. David had extended his kingdom out to its greatest extent from the Euphrates River all the way to the river of Egypt. He has dominion and power over many other countries that are round about. He committed this great sin with Bathsheba, but now as time passes, these children that he's had from his various wives are growing up and becoming young men. And there is a great rebuke that's found in these examples of polygamy. And we see that not only does it violate God's original plan for marriage of one man for one woman, but also in the law of Moses it said that you shouldn't marry sisters because they would be rivals with one another. We see in this story just how, well, really you could see it even in the story about Joseph, that his brothers were jealous of him, and you had that rivalry in the family. They had different mothers. Find the same thing in the family of David. He has a number of wives, and it causes all kinds of confusion and disorder. And it's because he's not following God's plan for marriage. It may have been polygamy, socially accepted and even religiously endorsed by a lot of the people living at that time. And David may have in all good conscience been engaged in this practice, not thinking he was violating anything. But we know that that wasn't God's original intent. And we can learn through the example of David and others in the Old Testament just how bad it is when people live in polygamy and get away from the original plan of God. Well, we're told that Absalom, the son of David, was a very handsome man, and he had a beautiful sister named Tamar. You know, Tamar is an important person in the house of Judah and in the genealogy of Christ, and a lot of young girls, I guess, were named Tamar. She was very beautiful. Amnon, Absalom's older brother, we're told in chapter 13, it should be 13, 1 through 6, that he fell in love with his sister, or fell in lust with his sister. She was very beautiful, and that's all he thought about. He made himself sick wanting to get together with this beautiful sister, half-sister that he had, Tamar, and he wasn't eating. He was looking haggard. And Jonadab, one of David's nephews, was a shrewd individual, a shrewd schemer that worked in the government and was an advisor. And he was also a friend of Amnon. And he said if he wanted to get near to his sister, that what he should do is pretend to be sick and ask for his sister Tamar to come and to wait upon him. And so Amnon followed this wicked scheme and wicked advice, and he pretended to be sick. And he sent, word came to his father David that he was sick, and he made a request that Tamar cook some food for him, his sister, and bring that food to him so that he might eat it. As oftentimes we do when people are sick, we try to give them whatever we can to please them in order to help them to eat and to get well. So David sent Tamar to wait upon Amnon, and she prepared some cakes for him. And after she had prepared these things and was ready to present them to her brother, he refused to eat them. And he said that all of the servants should be sent out of the house. And he asked that Tamar would bring the food into the bedroom and that he might eat the food there. And she went along with that and went into his bed chamber. And then he said to his sister, he grabbed her and said, "Lie with me." And this lust for her, just like Potiphar's wife had towards Joseph. And Tamar, just like Joseph did, tried to point out what a horrible sin this would be if he was to sleep with his sister. It was contrary to the law of Moses, and it was something that would be an outrageous thing to do in Israel, that he would be like one of the foolish people that doesn't live by God's law and that does disgraceful things, but he would not listen to her. She said, well, you could ask our father, he wouldn't deny you anything, and you could marry me. She was just trying any excuse that she could, any persuasion that might stop her brother, but he was stronger than her, and he raped her. And after this rape took place, just like we saw with Potiphar's wife, when she had this infatuation with Joseph, and then Joseph rejected her, then she hated Joseph and had him locked up in prison. People that have this obsession, this lust for somebody, oftentimes that quickly can turn to despising the person and hating the person if they're rejected, or in this case, as he has raped her, and now he hates the one that he has sinned with. He wants her out of his presence. He wants to forget about what he has done to her. And so he kicks her out. And she says that this is a worse sin than what you've already done to me, that he would just reject her now and ruin her life. And he has his servants throw her out and bolt the door behind her. And she put her hands on her head and ran away. You can just imagine the confusion and the desolation that Tamar felt as she fled away from this house in such a state of emotional turmoil, and went back to her house in great sorrow, tore her robe that each of the virgin daughters of King David would wear. She tore that garment as a sign of her mourning and her devastation that she had. And Tamar went back to her home, and Absalom, her brother, asked if she had been with Amnon. It says in the Hebrew, little Amnon, just as a term of derision against him. I guess he was a spoiled brat of a person. And she indicates that that's what had happened to her, and he told her to keep silent. He's your brother. Don't do anything about it. He'd take care of it, basically, is the idea. And we're told that when word came to David about what had happened, that he was very angry. But David didn't take any action to punish his son over this rape. I don't know if David's was weakened, probably in some way, by the fact that he had committed adultery and murder, and now this has arisen in his family. But he shows a weakness in carrying out a sentence against his son after the things that he himself had done in his life. And so we're told that Absalom, he had hate for Amnon. And of course, he had a determination to get his revenge. We're told that he wouldn't say anything good or bad to Amnon. This went on for a period of 2 years. I guess he's so angry and so full of rage toward him that he doesn't trust himself probably to say anything in his presence. It just shows again how one sin leads to another, and when things aren't punished in the proper way, things get worse and worse oftentimes in any society. And so we're told 2 years later that Absalom still has this plan, and he goes and requests of his father that David and the family come to his sheep shearing and have a celebration. And David said it'd be too much of a burden for all of us to come. And then he asked that Amnon and his brothers might come. And David was asking why would he want Amnon to come, but he continued to persuade his father, and he gave in and said that, well, his brothers could come to the sheep shearing, to this party that he's wanting to have. Well, we're told that Amnon had told his servants that they needed to act courageously and do what he said, that he'd protect them. And when he gave the order at the feast, they should kill Amnon and put him to death, of course, for this great sin of raping his sister. And so we're told that at the feast, when he allowed Amnon to get drunk with wine, to where his inhibitions were down, his ability to see danger was taken away. Shows again, always, you can see alcohol's a poison, takes away your self-control, your protection of yourself. It's nothing any of us should want to drink or get involved with. And here, when Amnon is off guard, the signal is given for the servants to kill Amnon, and he is put to death. And when the other sons of David see what has happened, they jump up, and you can just imagine the confusion. They might have thought they were all going to be killed at this feast, and got on their donkeys and mules and horses and took off and began to flee back towards Jerusalem. And we're told that after the murder, Absalom fled to the land of Geshur. Geshur, if you look at the map, it's to the northwest of the Sea of Galilee. It was an area where one of the subject kings that were subject to David and his kingdom, one of David's wife, had come from that king that he had married. So he, was a relative of Absalom, a grandfather. So he goes to stay with him and seeks refuge in that land. And David doesn't pursue him or go after him at that place. And after a period of 3 years of exile, David has ceased to mourn for his son Amnon, and now he has begun to mourn over the fact that Absalom is exiled and rejected and living in a foreign land. And Joab the general, the nephew of David, he sees that David is unhappy about this situation, and he comes up with a scheme to persuade David to bring Absalom back into the land. Joab finds a woman from Tekoa and tells this woman, who's described as a wise woman, to pretend to be a mourner before David. She goes in before David and she tells this fictitious story that Joab had told her to tell, in which she said she had two sons and they were fighting with each other, and one of the sons killed the other, and those were the only heirs to the family, and that now the avengers of blood in the family are wanting to take the life of the one who killed his brother, and then there wouldn't be anyone left to inherit in the family, and she'd be totally desolate. And she appealed to David to do something to protect the surviving son, and David said that he would make sure that the person was protected. If there's anyone seeking his life, they'd have to come to David. And she said then that David was being inconsistent in his own life. He had a son that had killed his brother and gone away into this foreign country, and that David should bring him back, that he also should show the same kind of mercy there. And David could see through this story that this didn't sound plausible, and said, "Is this Joab behind these words?" And she said, "Oh, you're like the angel of God, that you can see through these things," that it was Joab that had put her up to this. Then Joab is told by David to recall Absalom back to the land, and he can live in his own house, but he's not allowed to come and see King David. And Absalom is talked about in verses 25 through 27 as being beautiful in appearance, a handsome man without any blemish or defect in him, that he had a great amount of hair that he grew, that he would cut his hair once a year, and it weighed 3 pounds, the hair that was cut off at the end of the year. So very powerful person and beautiful person. And after 2 years, Absalom still hadn't seen David and been brought into his presence, and he was demanding that Joab come and see him and take a message to the king, and Joab wouldn't come. Maybe he knew that he was, he'd done all that he wanted to do for Absalom, getting him back into the land. And so to show again the nature of Absalom, that he's a person that wants what he wants when he wants it, and he's going to carry it out and do what he wants, even if it's murder. We've seen that already. That he had his property was next door to Joab's, and he set Joab's crops on fire And when Joab saw that this had been set on fire by the servants of Absalom, he came then to see him. And he said, "Why did you burn up my field?" And he said, "It was because I sent for you 2 times and you wouldn't come." You know, if there's some guilt in me before my father, then he needs to punish me, or I need to be restored to my father, one way or the other. And he took that message to David. And David then brought Absalom in, and he embraced him and kissed him. But, you know, this is now, you know, there's bitterness in Absalom's heart. This has been strung out this period of time without a resolution. And it seems that he's made up his mind. He's going to try to win the kingdom and the people away from David, and, you know, going to try to take the kingdom for himself. Well, we're told in chapter 15 about how it was that Absalom began to try to seduce the people away from King David. So David's been king, you know, for 30 years. You know how fickle people can be. Even though David has brought them unity, defeated all of their enemies, made them a mighty nation, over a period of time, people oftentimes begin to get tired of whatever ruler that they have. And here Absalom begins to set himself forth as the one that ought to be king. He sort of shows the heart of a politician in how to persuade people over and have the proper PR and all in order to seduce the population over to him. He gets a chariot and has 50 men to run before him in the street. So, you know, he has this way of traveling everywhere he goes with this entourage with him and this bodyguard that makes him look like a king everywhere that he goes. I'm sure David was humble shepherd king over the people, but here Absalom's putting on all of the airs of being a king. And he sides with any Israelite that comes to Jerusalem. They would come there for important cases that would go before King David, and Absalom would be there every day early in the day. He had a lot of energy in trying to win these people over. And anytime he met someone, he would ask what city they were from, and he would show them great attention, and he would tell them about how he would take their side if it was him that was judging them, that he saw the value of their case. And so he was winning over all of these men that would come from the different tribes of Israel to come before King David. When anyone bowed down before him to show respect for the king's son, he would go over and raise them up and kiss them and treat them with honor and respect and so on. And in this way, he began to win over the hearts of the people to himself through this, all of his PR efforts to try to win the hearts of the people. Then when the time was right and he'd gained enough allies and enough people to his side that wanted him to be king, he told his father that he needed to go down to Hebron to pay a vow to God that he had. Well, this was a lie. He was going down there to be crowned king at a place far enough from Jerusalem that he had some time to get his forces all together and organized in order to attack King David. So he went down. Then he sent out spies to all the tribes of Israel. When the signal of the trumpet was given and the message was sent out that he had been crowned, they were to announce Absalom is king in all of these different tribes of Israel. And we're told that he was proclaimed to be king there in Hebron. And then there were 200 men that he had brought down, important people from the city of Jerusalem that knew nothing about what Absalom was going to do. And it made it appear as if some of these other influential people, along with those that had already joined this rebellion, were on their side. We're told that one of the biggest allies that he had was Ahithophel. Ahithophel was one of David's chief advisors and wisest men living at the time. He's also the grandfather of Bathsheba. Some people speculate that maybe he wanted to rebel against David because of the outrage of him committing adultery with his granddaughter and all of that shame that it brought to the family or whatever, that might have been part of Ahithophel's motivation. But we're told many other people began to join this rebellion, and it was very strong. They were knit together. This idea of this bound together in this conspiracy, and more people are gathering to it. And David is completely unaware of what's going on. So it has all surprise on its side. Well, David had a servant that ran to him and told him about what had happened in verse 13. And David quickly says that he and his servants need to flee from Jerusalem. They don't want to be quickly captured within the city. And he doesn't want any harm to come to the capital city and destruction to be there. So he is gathering his people to leave quickly and get out of the land, out of the city, where he can raise his forces in order to resist this revolution and this rebellion by his son. We're told that he left behind 10 of his concubines, these secondary wives that he had, to take care of his house and watch over his property there until he returned. And David then began to flee from the city, and he went out to the eastern side of the city. He's going to flee towards the Jordan River and over on the other side of Jordan to try to rally whatever fateful forces he can get together in order to try to hold on to his rule and his kingdom. David's servants came with him. There were those that were from Gath when David had lived among the Philistines that had come over and joined David's kingdom and become his servants. The Kerethites and the Pelethites were Philistine bodyguards that made up David's court guard. They all went with David. Ittai was a Gittite who had more recently come from the Philistines to serve David, and he told him that he should go back in the city, that he had just recently come. He really wasn't a part of all of this family feud and rebellion that was going on, but he said he was going to go where David went. It's almost a statement like you have that Ruth makes to Naomi about how she's going to stick with her no matter what. And Ittai also says the same thing, that he and his people are going with David when he leaves the town. So David's most loyal, mighty men and soldiers go with him. So they're vastly outnumbered by the horde that's on the side of Absalom at this time. When they get outside of the town, Zadok the high priest and Abiathar and the Levites come to David with the Ark of the Covenant. They're ready to take the Ark of the Covenant with David and go with him. And David tells them that they need to take the ark back. He says, the king said to Zadok, return the ark to the city. If I find favor in the sight of the Lord, then he will bring me back again and show me both it and his habitation. So he said, this is going to be up to God whether I survive this. It's not going to be whether I have the Ark of the Covenant with me. He knew that just having that ark wasn't enough to assure God's presence and God's favor. But God would have to show favor to him. And if God was favorable towards David, then David would come back and he would be able to see the ark again and rule there in the city of Jerusalem again. He tells these servants, though, these priests, that they can work as spies on his behalf. They should send a couple of their sons to bring David word about what the battle plan is and what they can find out about what Absalom is going to do. And so he has loyal servants that go back to Jerusalem and are going to be able to be spies on his behalf. We're told that as David went up the ascent to the Mount of Olives, that he was weeping and barefoot. It shows his humility. He's mourning. He is appealing to God to take mercy upon him into this situation. And David hears about the fact that Ahithophel, his great counselor, has turned against him. And Ahithophel is a close friend of David, and he is a type of Judas, someone that's very close to the king, that was his close companion and advisor, and that sat at his table and ate his food. And David wrote a psalm about this betrayal, and it is also a psalm that points ahead to Judas, that it foreshadows the coming of a disciple of Christ that would betray him. In Psalms 41 and verse 9, even my close friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted up his heel against me. That's quoted in the book of John, in John chapter 13 and verse 18. In Psalms 55 verses 11 through 14, David also talks about his sorrow, that one so close to him has turned against him. And certainly, again, it foreshadows, what the Lord Jesus Christ felt when some of those closest to him, in Judas, turned against him. Destruction is in her midst, oppression and deceit do not depart from her streets. For it is not an enemy who reproaches me, then I could hear it. Nor is it one who hates me who has exalted himself against me. Then I could hide myself from him. But it is you, a man my equal, my companion, my familiar friend, who had sweet fellowship together, walked in the house of God in the throng. So this Ahithophel certainly foreshadows Judas, that was so close to Jesus, ate out of the dish with him, and yet went and betrayed the Lord over to his enemies. And how heartbreaking that was. Well, Hushai comes to David. He is an old man that is another wise advisor to the king, and he wants to go with David into exile as well. But David knows it's going to be a difficult journey. It's going to be very hard for an old person like Hushai to be able to go along with David and the men. But he can do something much better. He could go into the city of Jerusalem, and he could present himself as a loyal follower of Absalom and do what he could with his wisdom to try to turn this, whatever counsel Ahithophel gave to Absalom, against him, and help David in that way. And so he is sent back into the city to do what he can to help David. And then we're told that Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, his servant Ziba, that was taking care of all of the property of Saul that had been given to Mephibosheth, that he brought all kinds of provisions to David and to his men to sustain them as they were leaving the city of Jerusalem and heading towards the wilderness. And he asked where his master Mephibosheth is, and he told him that he had stayed in Jerusalem because he thought that as the son of Saul and Saul's family, that somehow or another the people would turn to him to be king. Well, this turns out to be a lie, and David's not going to find that out until he comes back to Jerusalem. But it causes David at this time of distress to think, well, even Mephibosheth has turned against him, and he gives all of the property over to Ziba to have the land that used to belong to Saul's family. Then we're told that David traveled from there. You can see on the map that the green arrow there shows where you have Absalom coming up with his army to the city of Jerusalem. And the red line arrow shows David leaving towards the Jordan River. And he has to go through several different valleys and so on as he's leaving Jerusalem. At Bahurim is where these events take place, just outside of Jerusalem on the other side of the Mount of Olives. So as David is going down there to Bahurim, to the Jordan, in chapter 16 and verse 5 through 8, there is another member of Saul's family, Shimei, that comes along on a hill that is next to the low road that David and his men are marching through. And from the that kind of goes through a valley, this road on the way to the Jordan. And up above them is Shimei, and he begins to curse David. He calls David a man of bloodshed. He blames him for the death of Saul's sons and for taking the throne away from the family of Saul and the tribe of Benjamin. And so he says that David is a worthless fellow, that all of these things are happening to David in this rebellion because God's against him and that he is cursed of God. Well, David at that time restrains Abishai. Abishai, Job's brother and a nephew of David. He says that we shouldn't have to put up with this cursing from this dead dog that is cursing David, and he should go over and just take his head off. He was always ready to shed blood and to kill somebody right away. And David said maybe Shimei had been told by God to come out and curse him. David was now a humble man. He recognized his fallibility. He knew that God had said he was going to raise up trouble for him because of the sin that he had committed. And he said it might be that all of this has been sent by God, and he'd be fighting against God to go cut this man's head off. And David shows this kind of self-restraint and letting God's providence work things out. Perhaps God, by letting him go through this humiliation, will look on his situation and will return good to him, since David isn't returning evil for evil and is turning the other cheek, that maybe God will look at this and show David mercy. So David sets another example for us of how we need to depend on God and not take our own revenge, but leave room for the wrath of God. So David and the people then travel on out of Jerusalem and on down to the fords of the Jordan River, and they arrive there weary, and they refresh themselves. They're told then that Absalom and his army, they enter into the city of Jerusalem. He has many of the men of Israel that are with him. Ahithophel, that old and wise counselor, is with him. We're told that he was so intelligent that people listened to his advice and treated it as if he was a prophet, like it was the word of God that was coming from him. Hushai then meets up with Ahithophel, or with Absalom, and he confesses that, he says, long live the king. He confesses loyalty to Absalom and says that this is, he's going to be loyal to Absalom now, where he used to be friends with David, because he's been chosen by the Lord and by the people, and Israel have chosen him to be the king. And just as he served the former king, he's going to serve Absalom and serve David's son, just like he had served David. And so he wins himself into a place of influence there with Absalom, where he's going to be able to help in overthrowing Ahithophel's advice. Absalom is told by Ahithophel, after he arrives in Jerusalem, that he should go into his father's concubines, the 10 concubines that had been left behind by David to care for the house. And if he went in and had relations with these 10 wives in a way that all of the public knew about, that would let everybody know that Absalom couldn't go back on this rebellion, that he would become odious to his father, that there could never be any reconciliation, that he's 100% into this rebellion. And the people would recognize, the die's been cast. And as a result, it would strengthen his hand in leading the people against David. So Absalom does this exactly like Ahithophel suggests. He puts a tent on top of the house and allows all the people to see that he's going into these concubines of David. And it fulfills the prophecy that God had given back when David's sin was revealed, that David had acted in a secret way in committing his adultery and murder, but his wives would be defiled in broad daylight. It would happen to him. And here it is being fulfilled. And it happens as God foresaw it. And Ahithophel, again, his counsel is just regarded as if it is the word of God. Well, David, you can see, is in a very difficult circumstance as you get to the end of chapter 16. There's a great army against him. He's exhausted, waiting at the Jordan River. He just has his main bodyguard that is there with him. They're vastly outnumbered. And in the next lesson, we'll look at how God is able to help David and how through his providence, David is going to be restored to the throne, and he's going to overcome all of these disadvantages and be able to regain the rule over the house of Israel, and how Absalom is defeated. And then we'll see how things are worked out for Solomon to become the king. I hope you'll find this lesson instructive, that you'll think about the principles that are found here. You'll look forward to the next lesson.